I hope you choke on every note. The table nearest us heard it. The woman with the pearl earrings stopped chewing. Her husband looked down at his plate. Margaret Walsh was smiling, that particular smile she reserved for moments she thought she'd won, tight at the corners, eyes fixed on me like she was watching something dissolve. She had just introduced my cake to 60 guests as a nice personal touch from home, had just used the phrase, not quite at the level of a professionally trained baker, and now she leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume and said those 6 words like she was wishing me well. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I pushed back my chair, stood up slowly, and walked toward the kitchen. The server was lifting the cake box with the careful energy of someone handling explosives. "Let me," I said, and I carried it out myself. "My name is Claire Bowen Walsh. I'm 28, and my mother-in-law Margaret has spent 4 years telling anyone who will listen that I don't have formal training. She's not wrong. I left McMaster after 18 months. What she never bothered to learn is why I left, or what I did instead. Those 18 months I was working nights at a French bistro in Hamilton called Arlette, and the head pastry chef was a woman named Suzanne Coty, trained at Paul Bocuse in Lyon, who took me on for reasons I still don't fully understand. I showed up every day, refused to leave, and 4 years later I could temper chocolate at exactly 31 degrees, build a croquembouche by hand in under 2 hours, and tell you why a soufflé collapses if you open the oven too early. Suzanne wrote me a letter when I left. It's still folded in my recipe binder, and it says I have the most natural instinct for pastry she's encountered in 20 years. Margaret has a culinary degree from George Brown, which she mentions every 2 weeks, and she speaks about food the way some people speak about credentials, as a hierarchy to be enforced. From the moment Daniel brought me home, she treated my lack of degree like a character flaw, and when Theo was born it got worse. She told her book club, while eating my lemon olive oil cake, that anyone can follow a YouTube tutorial. I learned to say nothing, not because I was afraid, but because when Daniel defended me she turned on him too, and I got tired of watching him carry that guilt. So I absorbed her comments and saved my energy. Until the engagement dinner. Margaret called me 3 weeks before the dinner. "I've signed you up to bring the engagement cake," she said, the way you'd tell someone they'd been volunteered for a car wash fundraiser. No question, no discussion. "Sophie wants something with berries and cream," she added, and then came the part she couldn't help herself with, "something at the level of the occasion, please. Not just a home thing." I told her I understood. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment, and then I opened my recipe binder to Suzanne's letter, read the line about natural instinct, and closed it again. I decided on a 3-tier white chocolate and raspberry entree met with a mirror glaze finish, fresh raspberries arranged in a graduated pattern on each tier, hand-pulled sugar work at the top, and the couple's initials in dark chocolate calligraphy. I practiced the mirror glaze 4 times until the surface was absolutely flawless. I got up at 5 in the morning the day of the dinner to assemble the final version, drove to Burlington with it packed in a cooler in the back seat, Theo beside it asking what was inside every 4 minutes, and when I walked into that private dining room I told myself I was making this cake for Sophie, for her warmth, her kindness, her genuine decency, and that whatever Margaret said or didn't say had nothing to do with why I was there. The dinner had been going well. Sophie cried a little during the toast, Marcus made a joke that landed perfectly, and for a while I had almost forgotten to brace myself. Then Margaret stood up. "Before we bring out the cake," she announced to 60 people, "I want to say a few words about the effort that went into it." She paused, looked at me. "Claire volunteered to make it herself from home." The way she said from home was the way someone says from a kit. Polite smiles around the table. "I thought it would be a nice personal touch, even if it's perhaps not quite at the level of a professionally trained baker, but the thought is what counts, isn't it?" She sat down. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table. I looked at Sophie, who had gone slightly pink and wasn't meeting anyone's eyes. I looked at Marcus, who looked like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. And then Margaret leaned sideways toward me, quiet enough that only the nearest table could hear, and she said it, "I hope you choke on every note." The woman with the pearl earrings stopped chewing. I let go of Daniel's hand, stood up, and walked to the kitchen. I carried the cake out myself. I set it on the dessert table against the far wall, and I lifted the lid. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens, not silence exactly, but a change in the quality of the noise. The mirror glaze had set perfectly. It caught the light and held it. The sugar work at the top had survived the drive and looked exactly as it had when I placed it that morning. Sophie made a sound I can only describe as involuntary, "Oh my God, Claire," and several people stood up to look closer. Daniel's uncle, who I had met exactly twice, said, "Who made this?" in a tone that suggested he genuinely couldn't believe it. Sophie's mother crossed the room to take a photograph. Marcus said quietly but clearly, "Claire made this," and looked at his mother while he said it. I served it myself. I cut clean slices, placed them carefully, and I watched people eat it and watched their expressions, and I felt a completely private, very deep satisfaction that I did not allow to show on my face. Margaret did not have a second slice. After the dinner, when most people had filtered out and we were gathering coats near the door, Daniel's Aunt Patricia, who had seated herself next to me for most of the evening, said, "Where did you train, dear? That was extraordinary work." I told her about Suzanne, about Arlette, about the 4 years I learned properly. And I watched Margaret, who was standing close enough to hear every word, go very still. I had not said any of it for her benefit, but I will not pretend I was unaware she was listening. The drive home was quiet for the first 20 minutes. Theo had fallen asleep in his car seat before we left the parking lot. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand over mine on the console. "She had no right to say that," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "I should have said something at the table." "You squeezed my hand." That was enough. He glanced at me sideways. "You knew," he said. "When you decided to make the entremet instead of something simpler, you knew exactly what you were doing." I thought about Suzanne, about 5 in the morning and the cooler in the back seat and 4 practice glazes, and the moment the surface caught the light perfectly. I thought about the look on Sophie's face. "I made the cake that was appropriate for the occasion," I said. "That's all." He laughed, short and quiet, and brought my hand up and kissed it. Margaret did not call the next day. She called 2 days later, and when I answered she opened with, "That cake was actually quite impressive, I suppose," which from her was something close to a formal apology. I thanked her and waited. "Where did you say you learned that technique?" "The glaze?" "From Suzanne Cote. She trained at Paul Bocuse." Silence. "I wasn't aware you'd had any formal instruction." "You never asked." Another silence, longer this time. "I see." 6 weeks later, at Theo's school concert, she showed up with flowers, which surprised me, and afterward, in the gymnasium with juice boxes and Rice Krispie squares on a folding table, she came to find me while Daniel was with Theo. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking at a point somewhere past my shoulder. "The comment I made before the cake. That was unkind, and it was wrong, and I've been thinking about it since." She was a woman in her early 60s with good posture and careful hair and a lifelong habit of using authority as a substitute for warmth, and she looked in that moment genuinely uncomfortable with herself. "I made assumptions about you," she continued. "Based on your education." "Yes, I know." She finally looked at me directly. "I didn't know about your training." "You never said." "You never asked," I said gently, not unkindly. "In 4 years, you never asked me a single question about what I actually knew or what I'd actually done. You decided what I was, and you stopped looking." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a different voice, smaller and more honest than I'd heard from her before, "I do that. I've been told I do that." I thought about Theo, who would grow up in this family with this grandmother, and I thought about what I wanted that to look like. "The mirror glaze technique isn't as difficult as it looks," I said. "If you ever wanted to learn it. I hold a small baking session at the house every second Saturday, just informal. You're welcome to come." She stared at me like she was deciding whether this was charity or an olive branch. I let her take her time. I might, she said finally. She came the following Saturday. She was stiff at first, asked more questions than she needed to, but she has good hands and genuine patience when she chooses to use it. By the end of the afternoon, she had produced a mirror glaze that was honestly quite respectable for a first attempt. She has been coming most Saturdays since. Last week, she brought her own piping bag. I have thought sometimes about why I offered that invitation. It was not because I had forgiven everything or forgotten the years of small accumulated dismissals. It was not because I suddenly understood her or felt sorry for her. It was because Theo will remember how the adults in his life treated each other. It was because I spent 4 years learning from a woman who saw something in me before I'd proven anything, and I understood at some cellular level what it meant to be given the benefit of the doubt. And it was because I knew, in the way you know things about yourself that took a long time to learn, that what I had built and who I was could not be diminished by someone else's assumptions. The cake was always going to be what it was. Nothing she said in the lead-up changed what happened when the lid came off. And through the window over my kitchen sink, I can see the maple at the back fence going orange and gold, dropping leaves in slow spirals in the October wind, and I think that this is a good life and that it has always been a good life regardless of what anyone chose to see or not see in it. No one can take from you what they never understood you had.